OtherWorld Interactive made a masterpiece. And then they made this. Let's talk a bit about it. So I just got into VR games last year. Like, really into VR games. And when looking for recommendations, a friend sent me Hello Puppets. Now, owning several working puppets myself, including one of a certain famous green frog, you could say that I had some interest in a puppet-themed horror game. So I picked it up next time it was on sale. The next hour and a half of my life is something that I will never forget. Now, I'm an empathetic person by nature, so I usually connect with characters from games on a degree deeper than most. But when I tell you, after the credits appeared on screen, I literally fell to my knees and cried. I'm not even joking. I sat on my knees and cried after the credits finished for a solid 30 minutes. That is a third of the entire runtime of the game. The story follows you, an intrepid college student working to get an article for their college paper about the abandoned Handyman studio for the Halloween edition. Handyman being a kid's show in the same vein as Sesame Street or the Muppets. Within 5 minutes, you find yourself surgically attached to a living puppet called Scout, who helpfully informs you that they've also sewn your mouth shut. How dark. You spend the next hour and a half talking to Scout and solving puzzles, as well as running and hiding from puppet and puppet-esque monsters. Now that's a very, very basic synopsis of the game, but I highly recommend anyone who owns a headset get it. It's cheaper than a movie ticket and worth 3 times as much. But here's the part that I genuinely enjoyed. It's a finely crafted, single-player narrative experience. And when I say finely crafted, I don't mean pretty good. I mean finely crafted, like the winning ice sculpture finely crafted, like the most beautiful sword you've seen in your life finely crafted. Now given, most every moment of this game is a scripted event, which does limit player freedom, but in a sense we've been overwhelmed by quote-unquote player freedom. You know what player freedom gets you? The mediocre schlock that we now call open world games. You know what single-player narrative experiences gets you? It gets you Halo, Uncharted, the new God of Wars, Mario, Mass Effect, Half-Life, The Witcher, Red Dead, BioShock, and that list goes on. Now, no hate to you if you enjoy the Far Cry series, or even the Assassin's Creed series, or insert generic open-world Ubisoft game here series, but there's a reason that almost everyone knows each of those game series I listed before. They're memorable. They stick with you. They're genuinely enjoyable and have a story to tell. Now, am I putting Hello Puppets up there with all those classics? No. I really wish I could. I really do. But it's just too short at 1.5 hours long to really be up there with those other ones. Now, I can easily call it a fantastic game of a quality that is usually not seen in the indie market that everyone should play through they get the chance. But now, unfortunately, we have to get to the sad part. The sequel. Well, prequel if you're being honest. In Hello Puppets Midnight Show, you play as Owen, creator of the Handyman, as he brings the main handyman Mortimer to life, who, subsequently, brings the other handyman to life, and forces you to play a deadly game of hide-and-seek, which on its own doesn't sound too bad. But I'm just gonna cut it off here. The game isn't good. It's fine, fine, but not good. Now, the acting, the script, the characters, the character developments and the character arcs, the modeling, the animation, the rigging, the audio mixing, the lighting, the art direction, all of that, 10 out of 10. Perfect. And at this point, you might be asking yourself, well, take all that out, what's left? I'll tell you what's left. The gameplay. The actual game. In the original VR game, the gameplay, if you will, boiled down to grabbing things and poking things in a specific way. But for what's going on, that's fine. It was aiming to tell a story and be an experience, and for you to gain a connection with the sentient puppet attached to your arm. So it didn't need super fancy gameplay, and since it was VR, even that simplistic motions of hitting buttons, of turning and pressing things, it was stimulating, because you're moving your actual body to do those things. On the other hand, Midnight Show is a game where you play through the same 3 levels 13 times. Within each level, you need to find 3 to 6 items that are scattered about and return them to the start of the level without being caught by that level's puppet. Knick-Knack the artist, Riley the scientist, and Daisy, the sweet southern mother. And to collect all roughly 78 items, You need to play the same 10 minigames 9 times each. Now, you may have misheard me. You may have heard puzzles. Well, that's a lot of puzzles, but that could be fun. No, I said minigames. And the minigames are as such. Find an item in the level. And that'll vary from you have 17 of those in your inventory to only one will appear in the entire map. Click and hold the mouse 1 button. Whack-a-mole. Clicking on a slot-like machine to match the correct face. Memory. The spinny wheel we had as babies. Simon. Doing math. Spot the difference. And that one minigame, I don't even know if it has a name, but you press the buttons and a specific group of other buttons light up, and I just keep pressing it until, it works. And after all that, each puppet has their own quote-unquote special puzzle to solve, which are spot the difference, more math, and follow the recipe. Now, my first run-through of each level was actually pretty fun. The minigames were simple, childlike almost, and at this point I thought, hey, the levels are like a kid's show, easy, simple, and fun, because the handymen were all stars of a kid's show. But by the time I got to minigame number 40 and nothing at all had changed, I was a little worried. By minigame 70, the only change was that Knick-Knack's paintings were getting, a smidge creepier. At this point, I was full on expecting to see the people we collect for Nick to have their throats slit, or the math that Riley uses to start involving algebra, something equally as evil, or for the ingredients that Daisy uses to start including human body parts, or something. Anything. That lack of anything dark was a little disappointing. The first game, it showed dead humans hanging from a meat hook like a pig carcass, and us human beings being used as batteries, blood splattering everywhere, and a dead corpse right in your face. The darkest thing about the prequel is that Knick-Knack's unrequited siblingly love is met with, implied beatings, which is dark, but not quite use every human in existence like batteries to power sentient puppets dark. But let's put the tone on the table, and we'll leave it for later. Back to the minigames for a second. The most telling sign, I think, that the minigames quickly turned from fun to an excruciating experience was when I started the first level over again for the second time and realized, damn, I gotta do this twice for this level and 3 more times for the other 2? At that point, I let out an audible groan. Not really the reaction you'd want from your player base. And these minigames, they get repetitive fast, and with no change in almost any of them, doing nearly 80 of the same 10 minigames back to back to back to back to back does not an enjoyable experience make. Last but not least, the hide-and-seek portion of the gameplay, a feature that is prominently displayed on their Steam page, which I like to call sprint around the map until you're caught, then sprint for a locker. That is the only way I got through with my sanity intact. Unlike other stealth games, which have a mechanic in which the player is warned when the enemy is nearby, or when an enemy is about to spot you, Midnight's Show has no such warnings, except for the puppet whistling. But every time I heard that whistle, it always came too late, as they would always be right around the corner, and catch me, instantly. The game expects you to run away into a locker. How do I know this? Well, because they're faster than you unless you slam a door in their face, and when you enter a locker, there's 4 different QuickTime events. That's almost half the number of mini-games. After which, the puppet will teleport away to a random location on the level, and if you have my luck, immediately spot you as soon as you exit the locker. Unlike other games, which might give you some breathing room between each spotting to build tension or create atmosphere, Midnight Show allows for the AI to spawn very close to you and spot you almost immediately. It's also very unforgiving with the AI's detections. There were times when I could have sworn I only caught the pixel of the puppet's left pinky finger, but they saw me and sprinted right at me. There are items that can make this section easier, like the sneaky shoes or the silly string, but I never really used those items, partly because they were in the vending machines and I needed the coins to pay for the required items, and also because it didn't really seem to matter if I sprinted or crawled or walked. The AI seemed to detect me by smell. They also consistently clipped through the lockers, and at one point the AI glitched and stood outside my locker for 5 minutes, before I eventually gave myself to death. Although I couldn't recreate this one, so maybe it's pretty rare comparatively. Also, the puppets just aren't scary. They're puppets made for a kid's TV show, so I can understand that they're not physically intimidating. But the only punishment is a scream in the face or losing items when you get caught, which makes you afraid of loss of progress and not, the thing. In the first game, there were plenty of breaks between the moments when you were meant to be afraid and when something was chasing you. Now, it was mostly the giant dog creature or a giant puppet monstrosity that could tear you limb from limb, but it wasn't a sweet southern mother who had a slight temper tantrum. So this dark comedy horror hide-and-seek game doesn't really have any horror and barely has hide-and-seek, and that leaves dark and comedy. This is where we bring tone back from where we left it on the table. The tone of the first game is crystal clear. It's a dark comedy. What this means is that there are some moments of levity that mix with moments of pure terror. 1 second, Scout makes a joke about not liking blood. The next, a body is dropped in front of you to, quote, test your reflexes. And the other, you're being chased by a brutal mix of human and puppet that the game likes to call Roscoe. Whatever it's doing, the game's tone feels consistent and brutally dark. Midnight Show, while maintaining the same tone throughout, is a very different tone than was achieved in the first game. It doesn't promote itself as a comedy game on its Steam store, instead leaning into the horror and the scares. But like I explained to you earlier, the puppets aren't scary, physically or from a gameplay perspective. So one would think the horror comes from the tone of the game, right? That's what I was hoping for as well. Now, in all fairness, the story does give a couple twists that are quite dark, like the aforementioned sibling beating, but those are hours apart and separated by way too many of the same minigames to truly have any effect on the player. The puppets will talk to you as you skulk around their levels, but it's mostly just idle dialogue and screaming at you when they find you. Nothing I would really call scary. The other dialogue is between the player character, Owen, and the puppets, but only when you enter their room and only for about a minute. Each of the puppets have their own little story with Owen as he tries to convince them not to follow Mortimer. However, none of these really bring in any horror either. Daisy just talks like a sweet southern mother talking to a dumb child. Riley tries to find a wooden animal to prove evolution, ultimately quoting Tolkien as a source. And Knick-Knack, Owen tries to convince to swap sides by making him jealous of what Mortimer gives to the other puppets. But nothing dark. At least nowhere near the first game. Which made me think of the last topic. The target audience. Any product worth its salt has a target audience. The first game was for those teens and adults who enjoy dark comedy horror. That's a nice, clear target. Put it on the dartboard. There it is. But what's the target market for Midnight Show? You might reasonably expect it to be the same teen adults from the first game, right? But like I said in the section on tone, it's really not all that dark, or that funny for that matter. In fact, I don't think there's a single drop of blood in the whole game. It's like they took the first game, sanitized it to the point where there's no dark comedy or horror in the dark comedy horror game. So maybe it's meant for kids? After all those minigames were like kids' toys, but then you get to the math section and it's pretty complex. For what would be considered a kid's game, at least. Heck, even I struggle with some of the later equations. Beyond that, they quote Tolkien without saying Lord of the Rings, and I doubt many kids would even know that author's name, or even appreciate that reference. And in the credits, a character references a drinking game, not something kids are really known to enjoy. The first game definitely isn't for kids. The gore and blood alone market T for teens. So the target market is muddled. Instead of that one picture of teens adults who likes comedy horror on the dartboard, there's 20 different pictures of 20 different markets, and the game completely misses the dartboard. In the end, one key thing that I think signals the difference between the two games is which part I enjoyed most about both. In the first game, it was the connection between the player and Scout, where it felt like a real conversation, even more so than most CRPGs, because to answer the questions, you had to actually physically move your head, giving you a sense of actually communicating. In the second game, my favorite part was the credits, and not in a sense of, oh god, thank god this game's over, but in the sense of, this is the only part of the game I genuinely enjoyed and actually laughed at. To quote Mothers Everywhere, I'm not mad. I'm just disappointed. We know that Otherworld Interactive can do better. Heck, we've seen them do better. The first game deserves all the recognition in the world. I mean, I've even talked to actual puppet creators about making myself an IRL Scout puppet. That's how much I loved that first game. But then they turned around and gave us... I know they can do better. We can leave the collectathons in the late 90s, and we can leave the Playpers to the 2008 Slenderman. And they can do what they actually do best. And they can focus on those best qualities. The script, the acting, the models, the art direction, the story. These are what made that first game so good. And I just can't fathom the reason to replace all that wonderful stuff with literal children's games.